Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Soybeans are found on dinner tables around the world. Some form of the soybean is found in baby foods, snacks, cooking oils, and many other food items eaten daily. And soybeans provide the protein in the diets for livestock and fish. The Nebraska soybean farmers support research to develop new soy-based products for foods, livestock, and industrial uses through their checkoff dollars. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Frayne Olson analyzes the wheat markets. Brad Lubben compares enrollment in ACRE and direct and counter-cyclical farm programs. Rick Rasby gives us an update on calving season, and Jim Gosey discusses the state of the beef industry. Story number one in Nebraska this week has to be the arrival of precipitation throughout most of the state. Snow in western areas and rain in the east, both significant amounts this time around. We'll have more on moisture totals and the chances for additional rainfall at the end of the show with Al's weekly weather forecast. North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson is our marketing analyst this week. We talked with Frayne Thursday morning about wheat condition here and abroad and his reaction to Wednesday's World Ag Supply and Demand estimates from the USDA.
There were two things that the market was looking for and focusing on. The first would be some of the things that happened domestically, the U.S. supply-demand conditions, and then the second to see if there was going to be any updates on the international side of things. And again, the primary focus has been on the corn supply-demand situation, in particular the usage. Given the fact that we had a quarterly stocks report that came up with some extra bushels of corn, the question was, how is USDA going to reallocate or adjust those numbers? And actually on that side of things, it was a positive report. There was put a little bit more of a bullish tone. The adjustments weren't as dramatic as some had expected. There was some adjustment or downgrading in the feed usage. There was a little bit of an uptick in the ethanol usage and a small downgrade in the export expectations. So the idea is that with lower prices now that will hopefully stimulate and bring back some of the domestic demand. On the international side,
Frayne, I guess that corn and beans don't, is that it will get the progress reports over the next couple months. Corn and beans, meanwhile, they may wait until June, maybe until a big report comes again to make a major shift. Is that accurate?
Yeah, on the wheat side, we've been watching the weekly crop progress reports and trying to get a feel for what kind of crop condition we're looking at. And of course, we're very late in the planting process right now, at least in the northern parts of the region, and we really won't get a general idea of crop condition for corn and soybeans in particular until later on this spring.
Right. What's the condition that you're seeing, other than what you're reading? What are you seeing overall across the Midwest as we look at the winter wheat start to come out of dormancy?
Yeah, there's parts of the southern winter wheat belt that has broken dormancy now. Obviously, the weather systems that we've had coming through the last couple of weeks have been providing some really beneficial moisture, and I think most farmers are looking forward to that. But with it has also come some very, very cold temperatures. And so the question, and everybody's looking at as well, is there going to be some winter kill damage? And again, the crop is not in very good condition right now, so additional weather stress is not going to be that helpful. So there's kind of a blessing and a curse to this extra moisture. We have heard some reports, in particular of Oklahoma, where the winter kill damage was a little bit worse than expected. As we move into Kansas and parts of Nebraska, of course, then it's kind of a mixed bag. It depends upon whether the winter wheat has actually broken dormancy or whether it hasn't yet.
What about in your area up there, Frayne, North Dakota, Canada? As you look towards spring planting of wheat, what are the conditions?
Well, we're obviously well behind where we were last year, but again, recognize last year was a very early year for us. So a lot of the farmers locally are saying, well, this time last year I was already planting corn or I was already planting some wheat. And this year we're not. We still have snow on the ground, especially in the eastern portion of the state. We've got this weather system coming through now over the next several days, going to provide us more snow. So it's been a very cool, reasonably wet spring. So we're not going to be as quick in the field as we were last year, but again, recognizing last year was a very, very early start for us. So are we concerned yet? Not quite, but if things don't turn around pretty quick, we're going to be concerned. And it actually gets worse as you go further north. As you move into the prairie provinces of Canada, into Manitoba, Saskatchewan, they've had more snowfall this winter. And again, they've had the cool spring. So far, the snow belt has been very limited. So it'll be kind of a late spring for some regions up there.
How about the U.S. foreign competitors? What are you seeing in those markets where they're still producing that winter wheat crop? What does it look like there?
Well, there's kind of two areas that we have our eyes focused on. One of them is, of course, the Black Sea region, and the other part is Europe. The European winter wheat condition is reasonably good right now, but there are some concerns in a few of the growing regions. The major emphasis, though, has been on the Black Sea, kind of what's going on there, and in particular in parts of Russia. We've been keeping our eyes on this throughout the winter season. Very similar to the U.S. hard red winter wheat producing region. There's a pocket in eastern Russia, in particular that Volga region, that was very dry last fall, had a very open winter. There's some concerns about winter kill. Recognize, though, that the growing region in Russia is very large for both spring wheat as well as winter wheat. So a portion of the winter wheat crop there is under some stress, but there's also a portion that's in a little bit better condition. The other thing we're watching, of course, is the Ukraine. The winter wheat condition in Ukraine is in much better shape. There's also expectation for some increased corn plantings in the Ukraine, which is, on the corn market side, something we need to keep our eyes on.
And finally, Frayne, if you look at that export market, is the U.S. gaining any strength there?
We are starting to see some recovery in exports now. If you look at the weekly export pace, wheat, in particular, soft red winter wheat class, has really seen some buying interest. There was an announcement a couple weeks ago that China came in and bought several cargo loads of soft red winter wheat, which was a bit of a surprise to everybody. They didn't expect that to happen, but it was obviously supportive for the wheat prices. And essentially what's happened is corn prices have softened. There's less pressure on wheat prices, which has made now the wheat prices more attractive internationally. And so we are picking up some export sales, which is good for the complex.
Next week, we'll look at corn and soybean markets with Wade Johannes from Central Valley Ag. Even though you may have received moisture over the last few days, UNL Extension forage specialist Bruce Anderson says your pastures could still have trouble ahead. Bruce says don't be fooled, the drought isn't over yet. Most years, we begin the growing season with quite a bit of moisture in the soil profile. But since that didn't happen this year, you probably need several inches of rain just to get back to where you normally begin.
Another problem might be with the health and vigor of your pasture and hay plants. Last year, these plants received a lot of stress from dry weather, hot temperatures, and in some cases, overuse. These plants will not be as thrifty this spring. Some may have even died. Those that survived will grow more slowly this spring and have difficulty regrowing rapidly after grazing or cutting. As a result, yields could be lower than average. What this all means is that you still need to manage your pastures and haylands for drought conditions. It could take a full year or more of average precipitation to recover from last year's drought.
Later in the show, we'll look at how drought has affected cattle inventory in the U.S. with Jim Gosey. The final spring semester speaker in UNL's Huerman Lecture Series says the world has enough food to feed its growing population, but inappropriate policies are affecting its distribution. Cornell University economist and World Food Prize laureate Pastures Anderson estimates 2.9 quadrillion pounds of food are lost every year, an amount he thinks could feed the 2 billion people the United Nations expects to see added to the world by 2050. Pastures Anderson says in the future, money needs to be invested in research and technology, as well as genetic modification. The extended Farm Bill will allow crop producers to make a familiar decision regarding enrollment in farm programs. Growers still have plenty of time to decide between ACRE, or average crop revenue election, and direct and countercyclical plans. We recently talked with UNL Extension public policy specialist Brad Lubben, who thinks one option may hold the advantage.
Given that we had a one-year Farm Bill extension that reauthorized the current program for one more year, producers suddenly had this ACRE versus DCP decision fall back in their lap that they had really back in 2009, except it's a one-year decision. So the analysis is this: should I enroll in the ACRE program, which provides some revenue protection against average revenue expectations on the farm, and give up 20% of my direct payment? Or should I enroll in the direct and countercyclical program, which gives me a countercyclical payment tied to prices, which is so far out of the money that we don't expect it to pay at all, and 100% of my direct payment? So it's ACRE versus DCP. Is the ACRE protection worth 20% of the direct payment?
Historically, this has been the decision to make, right? And what's worked in the past?
Well, it's interesting. In 2009, the ACRE versus DCP decision was one of how much protection do you get for the 20% of the direct payment you give up. And in 2009, it looked like the protection was pretty strong. You know, the revenue guarantee was average prices times average yields times 90%, and that gave us pretty strong protection under expectations. Since 2009, however, actual revenues climbed, and then 10 they climbed more, and in 11 they climbed more. In 12 they were expected to climb even further, and ACRE got sort of further and further out of the money. So to the point that we hadn't seen any major payments under the ACRE program for major Nebraska crops, a small payment for wheat in 2009, but nothing since. No payments, ACRE doesn't work. 13 is probably going to be a simple decision. And then USDA, National Ag Statistics Service, announced the yield results from 2012, and the dryland yield results for corn and soybeans were so severely cut that actually ACRE for 12 ends up making very big payments. Those payments aren't done yet. We don't have the final number yet, but we're talking about nearly $100 payments per acre just based on where 12 yields ended up. So now we look at 13.
Yeah.
We weren't expecting ACRE to pay in 13 either. If you take the current guarantees and you compare them to trend yields and current prices, you can't predict revenues falling far enough to trigger ACRE. So why give up the 20% of the direct payment?
Is that the recommendation?
Well, that's one answer. If you can't predict it, why would you give up 20%? On the other hand, we couldn't predict 2012 either. And that turned into be a huge role for the ACRE program. Any sort of analysis of 13 that includes that reality. I don't want to repeat 12, but we certainly are starting the year with less than optimistic expectations for yield. If the rest of the Corn Belt recovers, but Nebraska doesn't, we've got lower yields and probably lower prices. Suddenly that ACRE guarantee isn't so out of the money.
Is there anything that plays in here with what happens in Washington? Are farm programs capable of being touched here as we look at these new budgets that are coming out and when they could be implemented?
Well, that's also a consideration that really hit us just as soon as we announced the ACRE versus DCP enrollment for this year. What about potential cuts? We're giving up 20% of direct payment, but there was a chance we'd take that away anyway. Well, as best we understand it, there is no real threat of direct payments disappearing for this year. There is a potential across-the-board cut as part of budget sequestration that could take a few percentage points out of every payment, but there's no across-the-board cut of direct payments. Now, new Farm Bill, direct payments are almost certainly gone, but 2013 is the old Farm Bill revisited, and for now, direct payments, countercyclical payments, ACRE program payments are still fundamentally a part of that bill.
So if I'm making the decision, if I have until June, what are the things I need to weigh?
Right now, with June, we can offer prudence and patience. Look at the outlook between now and June. Where are yield expectations? If we really do get back to trend yield expectations because of good spring moisture and good recovery of the soil profile, if we're back to trend yield expectations and current prices, it's hard to make ACRE pencil out. It's hard to put any probability on ACRE triggering such that it's not worth the penalty. If yield expectations don't get back to trend, if price expectations fall, either of those or both of those really favor looking much more closely at ACRE.
Brad recently broke down the ACRE versus DCP comparison in a Cornhusker Economics article. We'll link to that on our website if you're interested in more information. Chuck Hibbard has a vision for an expanding extension division at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He explains that image in the April issue of Nebraska Farmer. Hibbard is a Nebraska native who recently returned to UNL as Dean and Director of Extension after a 5-year stint at Purdue University. He's putting in place a new model of extension, one that includes more on-farm research, expanded 4-H programs, and a bigger role in rural development. Hibbert says Extension is delivering unbiased, research-based information, but doing it through a different model today. He calls it co-discovery and co-learning. You can read more about his vision in the April Nebraska Farmer. Spring calving advanced rapidly over the last week. The latest state report, which was released on Monday, showed calving was 74% complete. The task obviously became more difficult for farmers and ranchers who received snow this week. We talked with Rick Rasby before the precipitation moved in to talk about record keeping during calving and the overall condition of cows in the state.
You know, March was a little cold, and we aren't used to having March being that cold, but I think for the most part we got through that in pretty good shape. You know, for as dry as it was last fall, and we ran cattle on corn stalks really we had a good grazing season on corn stalks. For the most part, I think cows are in really good body condition during this calving season.
That was maybe the one saving grace, huh, that you didn't get a foot of snow that covered up that cornfield?
You know, it was. I know that some folks would want some moisture, but boy, that really saved us because with a shortage of hay, it was going to be expensive to get cows through the winter.
So as you're still in calving or wrapping up calving, what are some of the records that you should be maybe taking an eye at or keeping as you go through that season?
Well, I think the ones that you think about most often is, you know, you record calf sex and weight, but the other thing that you'd want to record is calf birth date, and that can really help you, especially after you get through calving season, to do some calculations that I think are pretty important to take a look at herd productivity.
Anything to keep in mind with the cow as well, other than the calf?
Yeah, the cow and the calf go together, and you know that cow's supposed to do a good job of raising that calf, and so you really want to monitor her as well. And you think about calving date, that goes into how you might calculate calving distribution, which is an important number to get at.
Tell me why it's important.
Well, you think about you're going to sell calves at the end, and if you get more of those cows to calve during that first 21 days of the calving season, at a fixed weaning date, those cows that calve early are going to wean off heavier calves. And so the idea is to get the majority of the cows to calve during that first 21 days as compared to the second 21 days as compared to the third 21 days. And the more that you can get up into that first 21 days, I think gives you a good indication of really how well you've managed those cows, especially from a nutrition standpoint.
So what all goes into calculating that? I mean, how difficult is it to try and get them, you know, out first and on the feed right away?
Well, you think about the calculation. The calculation's pretty easy. When do you start that first 21-day cycle, if you will? Well, it can be done two ways. One is when the third mature cow calves. That would be when you start that 21-day calving cycle, and or the distribution. Or if you can just basically take 285, add that on to the date that you started the breeding season. That would be when you start that 21-day calving interval.
What else, Rick? Anything we missed?
You know, I think the idea is that when you think about that, the more cows that you calve in that first 21 days as compared to the second and the third, you know, that becomes pretty important because what you sell is pounds of calf at the end, and so the more cows that you calve the first 21 days, hopefully the heavier the weaning weight you have to sell at weaning time.
Next week, Rick will be back to show farmers and ranchers what they can look for in teat scoring cows after calving. Ongoing drought has had a major impact on cattle and cow numbers within the United States. Moving from as far south as Texas last year to the Midwest this year, drought has forced producers to cut herds in order to have enough feed and forage to get by. The lack of moisture, though, surely isn't the only factor making a difference in the industry's inventory. The USDA's cattle and calves count of 89.3 million head was the lowest January 1st stock since 1952. The inventory for cows and heifers that had calved on the same date was the smallest since 1941. Last week we talked about the state of the industry and the upcoming breeding season with UNL Animal Science Emeritus Professor Jim Gosey at his farm near Lincoln, where he now raises red Angus cattle. Jim, I'll start with this. Let's just talk about the drought overall. Where we stand right now, just as a cattle industry, can you remember a time where there was so much talk about trying to rebuild the supply with this difficult of circumstances?
Certainly not in my tenure of dealing with the beef industry. This is the lowest number of beef cows that we've had since early 50s, and so it presents some real challenges. And as an industry, we have to work very hard to maintain beef demand, given the small number of beef cows that we have. But the productivity per cow has gone up dramatically. And hopefully through management we can continue to maintain a great beef supply.
The science is there.
The science is there. We've never had as many tools to work with as we have now, and hopefully to manage risk. And I know that this is an opportunity to take some marginal cows out of production and really begin to focus on better genetics and cows that can really produce perhaps in a tougher environment.
Can you maybe relate to a casual observer how difficult it is for someone in the beef industry with costs this high, with feed costs this high, and uncertainty in demand?
Well, it's very difficult, and the real challenge is to be able to withstand one bad year, 2 bad years, and then still be in business. So in order to thrive, you have to survive first. Hay costs, for example, are double what they were 2 years ago. And so those kinds of challenges really present some opportunities for people to really become a lot better managers than they have been in the past. When times are good, management can be a bit lax, but when times are tough, there's no margin for error.
What about your industry here, the seed stock industry? What are some of the challenges you face?
Really, I think the challenge is to not stray too far off the center line of functional cattle with really good genetics. I think we're starting to see some work that relate to feed conversion efficiencies and beginning to measure that in a real way for the first time in a commercial setting. And so there's things like that, as well as DNA enhanced DPDs that offer us a real tool to do things that we weren't able to do 10 or even 15 years ago.
And certainly there's probably an opportunity here where you are talking about trying to build up such a stock that's so low.
Yes, and with all the tools that we have, we still have to maintain functional cattle that are sound in every way, and that go out and do a good job in the commercial industry. And never before have we had access to so many programs that can deliver true carcass quality and performance on the rail. And we have a lot of people that are taking advantage of marketing programs where some of these traits are being utilized better.
All right, for the producers out there getting ready for breeding season, that are getting through calving season, as these bulls nestle around us, what are some of the things they should be looking at or keeping in mind?
Well, I think it's always important to do a good job of managing bulls after the breeding season, during the breeding season. Most seed stock breeders do an excellent job of developing bulls as yearling bulls to use. But the real trick is how you monitor that bull during the breeding season and how you manage him after the breeding season, not to leave him out with cows too long, and make sure that bull is developed when he's 18, 19, 20 months of age, after he's pulled away from the cows. And that'll have a lot to do with the longevity that bull will enjoy in his life, and hopefully he will have a long breeding life. So management after the turnout and after he's pulled out of the cows is really, really important.
Now here's UNL Extension state climatologist Al Dutcher with this week's weather forecast.
Well, folks, here we are again for the weekly forecast. Of course, the big news was this massive storm system that moved across the central United States really slowed down and kept the precipitation around our region a little bit longer than last week's models were projecting. But indeed, it did hit the precipitation fairly well in terms of the quantity. We've seen an area of thunderstorm activity develop from south central Dundee County all the way up into northeastern Holt County, where within this line, upwards of 3+ inches of moisture were received, and total storm accumulations were approaching the 5-inch level across some areas of eastern Loop County. Yeah, then we also seen the significant snow accumulations across the northern Panhandle and western Sandhills. So the very valuable moisture did show us a reduction in the drought monitor from D4 conditions to D3 conditions. That's still extremely bad, but it is an improvement. It is showing that we are starting to see some benefits of this moisture. We're going to need to see many more of these events before we start to drop the level down to D2 conditions, but overall it does look like we're starting to see a little bit of improving conditions. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like we're going to see any very warm temperatures in order to promote corn planting. That looks like it's going to be about 10 days out in the future, but we do have to deal with another system moving in, and it does look like it may spread again some more snowfall across the state. So let's get immediately to the models and see when the bad news arrives. And For today, what we are looking at is a brief ridging that's going to take place in the Central Plains, and it should bring some fairly nice conditions. We'll be looking at probably the mid-60s across extreme southern Nebraska, more in the lower 50s across northern Nebraska, and out over the deeper snow, we may only make it into the mid-40s. Now, as we go through the next 24 hours, we'll notice by tomorrow we have a system rapidly moving across the northern plains, and we may see a little bit of cooling across northern Nebraska and possibly some scattered light precipitation, nothing major in terms of accumulation, dry toward the south. And as we get into Monday, this system rapidly moves toward the Great Lakes, and we see this big low starting to develop across the western United States, and we'll start to see temperatures slightly increase in advance of these, and precipitation possibly breaking out as we get late Sunday into Monday across the Panhandle, and more likely to occur as we get into Tuesday. As the system approaches, we should see some upslope flow and the potential for snow breaking out across the northwestern portion of the Panhandle, and the real activity starts to take place as we get into Wednesday. It's going to draw a lot of cold air in. This moisture is going to get wrapped around, and we could see some significant accumulations across the northwestern part of the state, and that cold air will start to funnel its way eastward as we get through the day Wednesday, and by the time we get to Thursday, the system will move its way to the Great Lakes, and we could see some wraparound snow with this system and some accumulating moisture across eastern Nebraska. By the time we get to Friday, this system starts to move out, and we start to see a ridge trying to build into the early part of the weekend. So in terms of the temperatures, we are looking for the warmest temperatures this weekend, and then as we move into early next week, we see some very cold conditions across the northwest with temperatures stuck into the low 30s to upper 20s with snowfall, and we'll see some of that moisture making its way eastward in terms of rain, and then we'll see a general change over to snow possibly Wednesday night into Thursday across eastern Nebraska. 8 to 14 day forecast keeps the cold temperatures in place. In terms of precipitation, we are looking for the above normal precipitation to move eastward. Notice this dry conditions moving in. That's a signal that warmth will move in here around the 20th to 24th of the month.
Thanks, Al. Our interviews with Frayne Olson, Brad Lubben, Rick Rasby, and Jim Gosey are available on our website as part of the April 12th episode of Market Journal. Next week, Wade Johannes will be our marketing analyst, and Rick Rasby will discuss cattle scoring after calving. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The Soybean Checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.